We look back at the Middle Ages and think we've come a long way, and yet the human imagination for pain might be one of history's darkest arts. Across centuries, people invented machines and rituals so cruel they almost defy belief devices that turned punishment into theatre and confession into endurance. But behind the horror lies a strange kind of innovation, an early brutal attempt to understand anatomy, psychology, and even social control. Today, we're diving into some of the most disturbing torture devices ever created, from the infamous Heretic's fork that punished sleeplessness to the Brazen Bull, a device so diabolical it turned screams into music. We'll keep the historical facts intact, but we'll also ask why these methods existed, what fears drove them, and how they reveal the psychology of authority and obedience. Because when you peel back the layers of cruelty, you start to see the roots of something bigger: our attempt to use pain as power. Let's begin with one of the simplest yet most psychologically devastating contraptions: the Heretic's fork, a device that made even falling asleep a mortal risk. Imagine being forbidden to sleep not by rules but by iron. The Heretic's fork was a cruel metal collar fitted with two small forks, one pressing under the chin and the other into the upper chest. It forced the victim to keep their head perfectly upright, because if they nodded off, the prongs would pierce deeper into the flesh. It wasn't designed to kill immediately, but to break the body through exhaustion. Victims would be left restrained for hours or days, unable to rest, swallow, or even cry out properly. This device was most famously used by the Inquisition, a time when religious courts hunted heresy like a contagion. It turned the act of questioning authority into a capital offense, and the inability to sleep into punishment enough. Modern psychologists compare this to sleep deprivation torture, still known today as one of the most effective methods of breaking human will without leaving visible scars. According to neuroscientists at Harvard Medical School, after just 48 hours without proper sleep, the brain begins to hallucinate, blurring the line between dream and waking reality. So the Heretic's fork wasn't just medieval cruelty, it was psychological warfare centuries before psychology existed. The metal collar reflected a philosophy: obedience through fatigue. Every sleepless night became both a punishment and a confession. In the flicker of torchlight, faith and fear fused into one endless vigil. A lesson that silence, not pain, could be the sharpest weapon. And while the Inquisition used silence to enforce obedience, another device targeted something more primal: the human voice. Next up, the Scold's Bridle, a weapon of humiliation that punished speech itself. You've heard of speak your mind in the 16th century, that could get you chained in iron. The Scold's Bridle, also called the brank, was a metal cage fitted around the head with a plate or bit that slid into the mouth. Some versions had spikes that pierced the tongue or cheeks if the wearer tried to talk, turning every word into pain. It was used primarily on women accused of gossiping, arguing, or nagging, a reflection of how society's weaponized silence against women's voices. They were paraded in public squares, forced to endure humiliation as a lesson to others. But here's where it gets interesting. Historians have found that these punishments often had less to do with justice and more to do with social control. In a time when women had limited rights, silencing them literally reinforced male-dominated hierarchies. From a psychological point of view, it also reveals a primitive understanding of behavior modification. The idea that pain and shame could reshape human behavior. This concept evolved centuries later into early psychological conditioning experiments, showing how fear can regulate communities long before laws do. In a grim way, the Scold's Bridle was society's iron version of cancel culture, a public display meant to erase dissent and normalize obedience. And while that device attacked the mouth, others targeted the body in ways so creative and grotesque, they sound almost mythical. If the Scold's Bridle punished the voice, the Blood Eagle punished the body and turned death into spectacle. According to Norse sagas, this ritual execution was reserved for traitors or those who insulted the gods. The victim's back was cut open, ribs severed from the spine, and then spread outward to resemble wings, while the lungs were pulled through the openings. It's said the person was kept alive long enough to see their own body become a grotesque eagle. For centuries, historians debated whether the Blood Eagle actually happened or was just Viking myth-making. But new archaeological interpretations, such as those from the University of Iceland in 2020, suggest that while it's unlikely to have been common, it could have been symbolically real. The ritual may have been staged partly for psychological effect and intimidation tactic to terrify enemies and glorify gods of war. What's fascinating is how the idea of ritualized torture blurs the line between religion and propaganda. The Vikings believed pain could transform the soul that suffering witnessed by others reinforced power and divine legitimacy. Anthropologists compare this to modern regimes that use public punishment as theatre, proving that across cultures, the control of fear is often more powerful than the act itself. The Blood Eagle reveals the oldest form of propaganda, turning pain into spectacle to sanctify authority. The myth survived because fear does. And if you think the Blood Eagle sounds like the height of cruelty, history says otherwise. Of all the recorded tortures in human history, few combine nature psychology and cruelty, quite like Scaphism, also known as the boats. Originating in ancient Persia, Scaphism involved trapping a victim between two hollowed wooden boats or logs, leaving only the head, hands and feet exposed. They were then force-fed milk and honey until they vomited and defecated themselves. To make things worse, their exposed skin was also smeared with honey to attract insects. Soon flies, maggots and beetles swarmed. They crawled into every open wound, every orifice. Each day, guards would return, feed the victim again, and reapply the honey, ensuring that the torture could last for weeks. Historical accounts claim one man survived 17 days before finally succumbing to infection, dehydration, and madness. While this may sound too gruesome to be true, Greek historian Plutarch and later Roman sources wrote about it, describing it not as myth but as an official punishment for traitors. Modern entomologists have noted that under such conditions, heat, humidity, and continuous feeding the body would indeed become a living hive, keeping the victim alive just long enough for decay to begin. Psychologically, Scaphism reveals something profound about how ancient societies viewed control. Death wasn't just punishment, it was a message. The body became the battlefield where morality, power, and fear were enforced one excruciating hour at a time. It was pain turned into spectacle and nature turned into executioner. And while Scaphism weaponized nature itself, the next torture turned simple metal into one of the most haunting instruments of pain ever built, the Brazen Bull. Few torture devices blend craftsmanship and cruelty as elegantly and horrifically as the Brazen Bull. Legend says it was invented in ancient Greece by Perillos of Athens, commissioned by the tyrant Phalaris of Acragas. The device looked like a life-sized brass statue of a bull, hollow on the inside, with a small door in its side. Victims were locked inside while a fire was lit beneath the belly. As the metal heated, the person inside slowly roasted alive. Pipes were designed inside the bull's snout to transform the victim's screams into a haunting musical sound, a grotesque parody of the bull's roar. According to ancient sources, when Perillos proudly demonstrated his invention, Phalaris betrayed him by testing it on him first. It's poetic justice if grimly fitting cruelty often consumes its creator. Modern historians question how much of the story is literal versus symbolic. But archaeological evidence shows that metal torture chambers did exist in antiquity. Not always bulls, but bronze or iron containers used for heating and execution. Beyond its horror, the Brazen Bull represents a strange turning point: torture as theatre. Public executions weren't just punishment, they were spectacle meant to remind people who held power over life and death. The bull's polished surface reflected firelight like a mirror, a glowing idol of fear. To the crowd it was justice, to the victim it was hell-made art. And if the Brazen Bull was the theatre of fear, the breaking wheel was its open-air stage where pain met gravity and the human body became a warning sign. If the Brazen Bull was designed to hide suffering, the breaking wheel was meant to show it. This massive wooden wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, turned human agony into public entertainment. The victim's limbs were tied along the spokes, and an executioner would methodically smash each bone with an iron bar. When the body was broken enough, it was woven through the wheel and hoisted upright for everyone to see. Sometimes death came quickly, but often it didn't. Victims could remain alive for hours, even days, their bodies slowly twisting in the open air while crows circled overhead. Historians say this punishment was used across Europe for murderers and traitors from the Middle Ages through the 18th century. In France, Germany, and Poland, it became a grim symbol of justice. The higher the crime, the longer the execution. But there's another layer to this horror. Medieval theologians justified the wheel as a reflection of divine order, the circle of sin and redemption, life and death. It's why saints like St. Catherine of Alexandria were depicted with the same wheel that symbolized their torment. Ironically, the tool that destroyed her body became a symbol of holiness. Today, psychologists call this kind of ritual moral inversion, when societies convince themselves that cruelty serves virtue. Some devices were built not to end life, but to permanently mark it, and the breast ripper is among the most horrifying of those tools. Used in medieval Europe, particularly during witch hunts and moral purges, This device consisted of iron claws, often heated until red hot, that were used to tear or mutilate the breasts of women accused of adultery, witchcraft, or blasphemy. The pain was excruciating, but the message was worse. The body itself became a public billboard of sin. Unlike quick executions, the breast ripper was designed to destroy identity. In patriarchal societies, a woman's worth was tied to purity and beauty. This torture deliberately defiled both. It was cruelty disguised as morality. Historians from Cambridge and Oxford describe such punishments as gendered violence, institutionalized by law. They weren't random acts of sadism. They were organized tools of social control meant to shame and silence. There's a chilling connection between devices like this and the idea of symbolic punishment turning anatomy into metaphor. The same societies that outlawed witchcraft also feared women's independence, and so they turned punishment into a lesson. Modern psychology recognizes these acts as ritualized fear conditioning. The same mechanism cults and extremist regimes use today hurt one to warn many. The breast ripper turned the female body into both target and message. But even beyond the human body, medieval punishments extended humiliation to every part of public life. In many ways, the Cangue, or shame board, was one of the simplest torture devices ever invented, yet one of the most psychologically crushing. Picture a heavy wooden frame, sometimes weighing up to 30 kilograms, locked around a person's neck and shoulders. The board was so large that the victim couldn't lift their arms to feed themselves or even scratch an itch. They were left to stand in public sometimes for days as passers-by mocked or ignored them. Originally used in China and later across parts of Asia and Europe, the Cangue wasn't designed to kill. Its purpose was humiliation to make the punishment seen. The inscription on this board would often list the person's crime in bold characters, ensuring everyone who passed knew exactly why they were there. It was in a way an early form of social media shaming centuries before hashtags or cancel culture. And like online humiliation today, its effects could outlast the punishment itself. People branded by public shame often found it impossible to reintegrate into society. Anthropologists note that such punishments played a powerful role in reinforcing conformity. When the pain fades, but the memory remains public, the punishment becomes permanent. What's eerie is how this ancient method mirrors modern psychology. Visibility itself becomes the torture. Sometimes the cruelest devices didn't have gears or blades, just a bottle. The castor oil torture was a disturbingly simple yet effective method of breaking a prisoner both physically and mentally. It forced victims to drink massive amounts of castor oil, a natural laxative. The body's reaction was immediate violent diarrhea, dehydration, stomach cramps, and humiliation. This wasn't just about pain, it was about control. The victims were left unable to move without soiling themselves, often confined in barrels or small enclosures, where they would literally drown in their own waste if they didn't confess. Castor oil had a dark resurgence in the 20th century, under Italian fascist leader Benito Mussolini, whose secret police used it to humiliate political opponents. Drink enough of it, and you wouldn't die, but you'd wish you had. Historians call it the cheapest weapon of dictatorship. Modern medical science explains why this worked so well. The oil triggers the intestines by releasing ricinoleic acid, which violently accelerates bowel movements and drains the body of electrolytes. Within hours, victims experienced delirium and total loss of dignity, exactly the result their captors intended. What makes the castor oil torture so haunting is that it weaponized something safe. It wasn't poison fire or iron, just biology turned against itself. At first glance, it looked harmless, almost elegant, a small metallic object shaped like a pear. But once inside the body, the choke pear became a nightmare. Used during the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, this device was inserted into a victim's mouth, anus, or vagina, and then slowly expanded using a screw mechanism. Each turn of the handle caused its metal petals to spread apart, tearing soft tissue until it was impossible to scream, move, or even breathe. Interrogators used it to extract confessions or as punishment for blasphemy, sodomy, or adultery. And though many versions were later exaggerated by 19th century sensationalism, evidence in European museums shows the device did exist, a cruel blend of craftsmanship and sadism. The choke pear symbolizes something chilling about the human mind, the ability to design suffering with precision. Psychologists today call this instrumental cruelty when pain isn't an accident, but a methodical process built for efficiency. And beyond the horror, the choke pear reveals how fear ruled justice. Courts believed that truth could only be found through pain, and that confession cleansed the soul, a logic that fused religion with repression. Interestingly, modern medical historians compare this to the earliest experiments in mechanical dilation. the same concept later used in life-saving medical tools but originally born from instruments of torture. The line between healing and harm once again was terrifyingly thin. But if the choke pear tore the body from within, the next device did the opposite, crushing it from the outside, one agonizing turn at a time. If pain had a sound, it might be the slow metallic groan of the head crusher tightening. This was a simple, brutal mechanism. A metal cap rested on the victim's head while their chin was placed on a lower plate. Between them, a threaded screw. Each turn forced the cap downward, crushing the skull, jaw and teeth sometimes, until the eyes literally burst from their sockets. It was a favorite of inquisitors across Europe, especially during the 16th and 17th centuries, when confessions were seen as proof of guilt. The genius and horror of the device was that it worked in stages. The first few turns didn't kill, they just caused unbearable pressure and pain. Only later, after the face was destroyed, came death. To modern neurologists, this kind of torture demonstrates how pain can rewire the brain. Under extreme pressure, the human nervous system floods with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, triggering hallucinations and panic. Victims might confess to anything, not out of guilt, but to make the world stop existing for a moment. The head crusher also marked a grim milestone in technology, the idea of controlled destruction, inflicting maximum suffering with minimal mess. It's the same twisted logic behind later inventions like the guillotine or electric chair, where efficiency was mistaken for mercy. It looked like a throne until you sat on it. The iron chair, sometimes called the chair of torture, was a chilling blend of authority and agony. Forged entirely from metal, it was covered with hundreds, sometimes thousands of sharp spikes across the seat backrest, armrests, and even the footrests. Victims were stripped, bound tightly in place, and left to sit for hours or days. The spikes didn't always pierce deeply at first. That was the point. The longer the person sat, the more their body weight drove the spikes into their flesh. Some versions were heated from below, turning the entire seat into a slow-cooking device. It wasn't just about pain, it was about symbolism. The iron chair represented the power of the throne itself, where rulers and inquisitors literally sat above their victims. In some German and Italian courts, it was placed in public halls as a reminder of justice. Modern historians view it as an early form of psychological deterrence, what today's criminologists might call spectacle punishment. Its goal wasn't simply to torture, but to imprint fear onto society. Forensic engineers who've reconstructed the chair found that it could take over 48 hours for someone to die, often from infection, blood loss, or shock. The body's own endurance became its worst enemy. Keelhauling sounds like a pirate movie punishment because it is. Sailors who broke severe rules were tied to a line, thrown overboard on one side of the ship, and dragged under the keel to the other side. The hulls, barnacles, and timbers shredded flesh. If someone survived the drag, they were hauled up and often dropped again. It was naval punishment designed to terrify a tight crew into obedience. Modern naval historians point out it wasn't universal. It appears in some Dutch and Mediterranean records, but the image stuck the sea as a public execution chamber. Now switch theaters to Imperial China, where Lingchi, or death by 1,000 cuts, turned execution into an ordeal of staged mutilation. The condemned was slowly dismembered over hours to days. While some sensational accounts exaggerated the method Chinese legal history shows, Lingchi was reserved for the gravest crimes, treason or regicide. Anthropologists read this as extreme symbolic degradation, the state literally unmaking a person's body to erase their social existence. Today, it's a chilling lesson on how legal systems can weaponize shame and physicality. Speaking of systematic pain, meet the rack, medieval Europe's answer to extract information. Victims were tied, and the frame's rollers turned, stretching limbs and dislocating joints. The anatomy of confession plays out here as muscles tear and nerves ignite false memories, and forced admissions become more likely. Neuroscientists now explain why torture-produced confessions are unreliable, intense pain. Floods the brain with stress hormones, disorienting memory, and increasing suggestibility. That insight helped shift legal standards away from torture centuries later. Between the rack and the keel, cruelty took many clever forms. The scavenger's daughter did the opposite of the rack, crushing the body into a compact, crouched posture, causing internal injuries without external trauma. The strappado, or hoisting, bound wrists behind the back and lifted victims until shoulders dislocated, crippling but not instantly fatal. By the late Renaissance, torture was no longer just about steel and flame. It evolved into something far more intimate: psychological annihilation. The White Room was the perfect example. Victims were confined in a featureless, soundproof space. Every surface, from walls to clothing, was pure white. There were no shadows, no sounds, no textures. Even the food, when it came, was white rice or milk. Days blurred into weeks, and eventually the mind started to collapse. Prisoners described losing their sense of time, self, and reality. Modern psychologists confirm that such sensory deprivation induces hallucinations. Panic and cognitive breakdown effects studied decades later by institutions like Harvard and McGill during Cold War experiments on isolation. Then there was the Oubliette, from the French oublier, meaning to forget. Unlike a normal dungeon, it was a narrow, vertical pit, barely wide enough for a person to stand. Prisoners were dropped in and left no light, no sound, no human contact. They weren't executed, they were erased. Medieval records show prisoners found years later as skeletons standing upright, a final image of endurance and despair. These methods reveal a terrifying truth. Once society mastered physical pain, it sought to control the mind. This shift from body to psyche marks what historians call the evolution of power, where obedience comes not from fear of pain but from fear of invisibility. Even instruments that targeted the tongue, like the tongue-tierer, embodied this philosophy. They didn't just punish, they erased speech, silencing dissent before it could echo. In an era without social media, this was the original censorship machine. If hell had furniture, it might look like this. The Iron Maiden, one of the most infamous torture devices in history, was shaped like a standing sarcophagus lined with spikes. The victim was locked inside, the doors closed slowly, and the spikes pierced flesh but not deeply enough to kill right away. Blood loss, infection, and suffocation followed. Though some historians now argue it was more of a 19th century myth inspired by earlier devices, its symbolism is undeniable. The illusion of security turned into entrapment. Then came the Judas Chair, also known as the Judas Cradle. Imagine a pyramid-shaped seat sharp at the top, where the victim was slowly lowered, the entire weight of their body pressing down on a single point. It was meant to tear, to humiliate, to make pain a spectacle. The design itself feels surgical precision, cruelty masquerading as justice. The Spanish donkey worked on a similar principle. A narrow wooden beam shaped like a triangle on which the victim sat astride while weights were tied to their ankles. Each added pound meant deeper lacerations. It was, in essence, the medieval version of mechanical punishment, leveraging simple physics to multiply suffering. And finally, the flaying of the living. The rawest form of torture, in which executioners literally peeled away the skin layer by layer. In ancient Assyria, flayed bodies were displayed on city walls as warnings. To them, this wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda. From iron to isolation, from blades to silence, these devices reveal a grim truth. Pain was once considered a form of truth. The human body became a stage where power performed its dominance. But even in this darkness, there's something to learn about resilience, empathy, and how far we've come. The very laws that protect us today were written in the shadows of these machines. Because understanding cruelty isn't about fascination, it's about prevention. And maybe, just maybe, knowing how deep humanity once sank is the best reason to never go back. The more we understand the darkness of history, said philosopher Hannah Arendt, the more clearly we can see the value of light. If you found this journey chilling but fascinating, remember, there's always more history hidden in plain sight. Which of these ancient devices shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments, and if you love exploring how science, history, and human psychology collide, subscribe for more videos every week.